Well, for more on this, I'm joined now by Bernard Haykel, who is a professor of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us, Professor Haykel. Lots is happening in Geneva. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi is there. He's been meeting today with Rafael Grossi, the Director General of the IAEA, meeting the US delegation tomorrow for a second round of talks. And I want to ask you, is diplomacy, in your opinion, the Trump administration's preferred path with Iran?
Well, thank you first for having me. I don't know if they're meeting directly with the Americans. I think they go through intermediaries. So the Iranians have, for many decades refused to meet face-to-face with Americans, which I personally find to be unacceptable as an American. And I think the Americans should refuse to engage with them unless they engage directly. The second point is, yes, I think the Trump administration would rather solve this through diplomatic channels and through mediation rather than resort to a strike on Iran. But I'm not hopeful that the Iranians will agree to the terms of the Trump administration, because frankly, those terms are indeed very hard. They want the Iranians to give up on their nuclear enrichment. They want them to give up on significantly reduce their ballistic missile program. And they also, the Americans also want the Iranians to stop funding and arming and training and supporting non-state actors around the Middle East. And all three conditions or all three demands are unacceptable to the Iranians.
Okay, and on the one hand, we're hearing the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying the US does want to deal with Iran. Then we've heard in the last few days President Trump saying that a change of leadership in Iran is the best thing that could possibly happen. I mean, what do you read as being Washington's desired outcome here?
Yeah, so President Trump, was critical of the regime change that the Bush administration conducted in 2003 in Iraq. So he has this new model, which let's call it the Venezuela model, which is essentially to get rid of the top leadership of a regime, but to keep the regime itself in place and to replace the leader with a new leader, and then to cut deals and to make agreements with this new regime, with this new leadership, rather, of the same regime. And what Trump is offering is basically a rehabilitation and a development of the Iranian oil and gas sector, telling the Iranians, you'll make a lot of money if you agree to our terms, and we can eventually remove all sanctions, and just behave like a normal state and let the oil and gas flow, and everything will be fine. That's essentially Trump's pitch to the Iranians. It means that the Iranians would have to give up on their ideological commitments, their revolutionary commitments, which have been there since 1979. Iran is a revisionist power that wants to see the destruction of Israel and the expulsion of the United States militarily, culturally, and economically from the Middle East. That's not going to happen.
Right. And, these last 18 months, we've seen various moments at which the leadership in Iran has looked extremely fragile. And a deal like the deal that, it appears the United States wants would obviously be a deal with the current leadership. We have to assume, unless you have any other thoughts on that. But wouldn't that give the leadership a new lease of life?
Well, it would give the regime a new lease of life, certainly, not the leadership. I think, as President Trump has said, he wants the Grand Ayatollah or Ayatollah Khamenei to be replaced with, say, a general from the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps or some other element of the regime. So yes, it could give a new lease of life for this regime. And if the Americans decide to attack militarily, that could, in fact, destabilize the regime very significantly. Although I think that the Iranian regime is very well entrenched. It still has about 20% of the population on its side. It has an incredibly powerful repressive security apparatus, which kept held together during the latest demonstrations. And we saw that on January 8th and 9th, they were willing and able to kill tens of thousands of their own citizens. So this is not a regime, I think, that will fall easily.
Right, but if only 20% of the population supports, and there's 90 million people in Iran, if 20% of them support the leadership there, doesn't that suggest that there are fractures that could be exploited by the United States?
I mean, potentially, but the problem is that the opposition to this regime, so the other 80% of the population, don't have united leadership. They're extremely segmented or fragmented. The opposition is not united. And that's a source of major weakness for the opposition and strength for the regime itself.
We were covering, Professor Haykel, last week, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's visit to the White House. And I just wonder whether, I mean, we assumed from talking to people last week that diplomacy perhaps wasn't Israel's preferred option at this particular moment. I don't know what your thoughts are there. Yes. Do you think that visit by Prime Minister Netanyahu changed anything?
Well, I think the Israelis actually want to attack the Iranians. They see the Iran regime is at its weakest point. They've destroyed its air defense capabilities in last June with the 12-day war, the so-called 12-day war. And they've clearly penetrated the regime almost entirely. The Israelis have. So I think the Israelis want to knock out this regime with another attack. And that's my reading is that Prime Minister Netanyahu was trying to pitch that to President Trump, and President Trump said, no, we're not going to attack. We're going to try negotiations first. And the way the Iranians have responded to this potential Israeli attack is to say to the Americans and to the Arab Gulf states that if we're attacked and if our regime is existentially threatened, we will launch an all-out attack with short-range and medium-range missiles, which they still have thousands of, against the oil facilities, the water desalination facilities, electricity generation facilities, and communication facilities. So basically all the vital facilities of countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait. So the Iranians are threatened to burn the whole region if they're attacked again, and that the regime risks falling.
So fair to say that leaders across the GCC have been steering President Trump towards restraint, therefore?
Yes, I think so. I think so because, you know, they don't have effective defenses against these thousands of missiles and cruise missiles and drones that the Iranians have across the Gulf. So, yes, they don't want to see an escalation and an attack on their own territory. Also, I think the Gulf states have a very different perspective from that of the Israelis. I mean, Iran is a neighboring country with 90+ million people. If the regime topples and there's a civil war in Iran, God forbid, you know, this could lead to massive refugee flows and incredible instability in the region. So countries like Saudi Arabia, you know, have a long-term view of Iran, not a short-term one. Even though they despise the regime in power in Tehran, they don't want to see the country implode.
How divided would you say opinion is within Washington itself on how best to proceed? And do you think the divisions are purely along partisan lines?
No, I think there are also I mean, certainly the Democrats don't want a military attack on Iran, but also within the Republican Party, there's, I think, a division between, you know, sort of the isolationists or what we call the restrainers versus the more hawkish types who would like to use force, although limited. So as I said earlier, there's this new model of the Venezuela model where the military strike is extremely limited in time and in you know, what takes place, and so it's not a full-on invasion of the country. And Trump is not a restrainer; he's not an isolationist, but he also doesn't want war. I think what he sees in Iran is another country like Venezuela in this axis of resistance to America that is weak and that is also extremely oil and gas rich. President Trump is obsessed with having more oil and gas come onto the international market. He wants lower oil prices, and he thinks that if Venezuelan oil and Iranian oil were to flow, the prices would go down, and that would help with his prospects in the midterm, the Republican Party's prospects in the midterm elections next November.
All the while, and while we gather the USS Gerald Ford aircraft carrier is on its way to the region, making it the second US aircraft carrier to come to the region, the Revolutionary Guards are holding drills, live-fire drills, in the Strait of Hormuz. What message do you think they're trying to send, given that these overtures in Geneva are happening, you know, tomorrow and as we speak?
Yeah, I think that this is all a kind of signaling from one side to the other that, the Americans are saying essentially, we have the firepower to destroy your country, and the Iranians are signaling that, we have sufficient capacity to block the Strait of Hormuz, which is where 20% of world's global oil is shipped through that strait. So that, if there's a clash and Hormuz were to be blocked, you would have a major global economic depression. I mean, the price of oil would spike, to well above $150 a barrel, and that would cause an instant recession, if not a depression, around the world.
Professor, one thing we hear from some of the analysts we speak to on this subject is that a US attack on Iran of pretty much any description could have the effect of strengthening the leadership in Iran. Do you subscribe to that?
No, I mean, I think the leadership in Iran is already quite strong in terms of its resilience and its ability to survive. I mean, this is also a leadership that has lost the trust and lost its legitimacy with 80% of the Iranian population. So I don't think an American attack is likely to change the opinion of 80% of the Iranian public. In other words, we're not going to see a rallying around the flag or some great nationalist movement in support of the mullahs, that is the clerics who rule Iran. I think they're hated by the vast majority of the population, no matter what America does, but they just don't have the capacity to do anything about changing the regime. So those who argue that, the mullahs are legitimate and they, and that an American attack, would strengthen them and so on, are basically apologists for the regime. They're trying to defend the regime.
Okay, Professor, just to bring the conversation to a conclusion, turning our eye back to Geneva, where these talks are taking place over the course of the next couple of days. Supposing a deal is struck there, does such a deal, obviously it would depend on the deal, but does a deal in principle make the Middle East region, the Gulf, more stable? Or do you think it's just a delaying of what will eventually be a larger confrontation?
I mean, in the immediate term, it would make the Gulf more stable. Is there likely to be a confrontation longer term? I think so, especially between Israel and Iran, if the Iranians pursue their nuclear weaponization program, as well as if they continue to support, movements like Hezbollah and the Houthis and Hamas, whose aim is to destroy Israel. So Israel will, will not tolerate that. And so the Middle East is driven between two kind of forces, if you like, or two camps. One camp wants to see a complete redrawing of the map of the region. And I would put the mullahs in Iran and also the extreme right-wing forces in Israel in that camp. I mean, obviously, they're two sides of the same coin, but they both want to see the region completely changed. And then you have the status quo camp, or the camp that wants stability, order, economic prosperity, and that would include Saudi, Kuwait, Egypt, and the UAE, of course.
Okay, well, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Thank you so much, Professor Bernard Haykel at Princeton University. Thank you, sir, for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Well, joining me now is Fred Fleitz, former Chief of Staff of the US National Security Council under President Trump. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, as ever, here on Arabiya English. A pleasure having you. Does it look to you like diplomacy is the Trump administration's preferred path here with Iran?
Oh, yes. Diplomacy is always the first choice for President Trump. He wants to exhaust all tools of statecraft short of military force before he commits any kind of military power, the use of military troops. So we're going through the motions right now to see what can be done when Iran is so extremely weak. I have to say, I don't think the prospects for an agreement are very good, but the president is going to pursue this.
Right, and at the moment, the scope of the talks pretty much purely nuclear by the sounds of things. Do you think that if they don't discuss Iran's ballistic missile program and they don't discuss Iran's support for regional proxies, they'll be missing quite an important opportunity, won't they?
The Iranian regime is expert at creating the appearance that it is willing to negotiate, of creating the illusion that there is an agreement to be had, but there's not. the Iranian regime only wants to talk about its nuclear program, but will not give up uranium enrichment, which it is using to develop nuclear weapons. It won't talk about missiles. It won't talk about its proxies. It will not talk about halting the brutal assault on the Iranian people who are protesting for freedom. I understand as many as 36,000 have been murdered by this regime since January. President Trump thinks that is unacceptable. These four conditions at a minimum are necessary for a deal, and I don't see the Iranian regime willing to negotiate on them.
Okay, I mean, the leadership, as you alluded to in your first answer, has looked pretty fragile at several moments during the last 18 months or so. And I'm wondering whether you think there's a risk that by striking a deal with the current leadership in Iran, effectively, the United States will be giving them a new lease of life, won't they?
I don't see President Trump ever agreeing to that, but he is going to pursue this diplomatic track to see if an acceptable agreement along the lines I just outlined are possible. But there's another reason the U.S. is doing it. That's because our allies in the Middle East asked us to, especially Saudi Arabia. They want diplomacy tried. They want a good effort made to try to avoid a wider conflict. I think there's a concern by states in the region what this weakened Iran might do if it is attacked again.
Okay, I mean, if the talks don't succeed, then what happens? Because Iran has threatened to strike US bases across the Middle East. Some are saying that a broader conflict will ensue. How broad do you think we could be talking here?
Look, Iranian leaders are always making threats, so I wouldn't give that too much credibility. And I think if Iran tried to strike American bases, the response by the United States and Israel would be devastating. The U.S. and Israel used a small proportion of their military power last June against Iranian missile and nuclear sites. I think it's possible that the Revolutionary Guard Corps headquarters, maybe areas where ammunition, weapons are being kept that are being used against Iranian protesters, they may be taken out. But I also think that the administration is looking at a long-term plan to stand with the Iranian people, because I think it will be a long and difficult struggle to oust this bloody regime.
Okay, I mean, we've heard from President Trump in the last couple of days saying that a change of government in Iran would be the best thing that could happen, or words to that effect. At the same time, we have these talks happening. We also have the USS Gerald Ford, the second US aircraft carrier to head to the Middle East in as many months. What do you think Washington's desired outcome is here?
Well, President Trump wants to see an end to the nuclear program, as I said, including enrichment, an agreement on missiles, agreement on proxies, and an agreement to stop the violence against Iranian protesters. And that also should include releasing all political protesters who have been imprisoned in some of Iran's incredibly inhumane prisons since January.
Do you think Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu's visit to Washington last week, a fairly last-minute visit he made to obviously convey a message to the president, and we can assume, you know, Israel prefers action rather than diplomacy. I don't know what you think of my assumptions here, but do you think that meeting changed anything?
I think your assumption is right. I don't think Netanyahu sees any point in diplomacy, but President Trump, his first inclination is to exhaust all options other than war. And I think they're actually both on the same page. I think both Netanyahu and Trump realize the chance of getting a deal may be close to zero, but Trump is still going to try.
Do people in the United States think this is perhaps the last chance for, and to strike while the iron is hot, so to speak, and bring about meaningful change there in Iran? Because there must be some people who are advising President Trump that if we don't do something now, we being the United States, it's now or never.
There are reasons to strike now, aside from the protests. Iran is rapidly rebuilding its missile program. There are underground facilities where it apparently is preparing to start rebuilding its nuclear weapons program. That's where Israel was talking last year about the need for another round of attacks. But if you're asking about the view of the American people, this issue is covered so badly in the American media. I don't think most Americans know enough about this subject to have an opinion.
What about on Capitol Hill? Are the opinions divided? Is that according to party lines? Or what's the sort of the general consensus?
You know, I think there's general support for the route that President Trump is taking, but I couldn't tell you exactly.
In terms of US options at this stage, apart from the military option, are there other options that you can identify, perhaps some covert options?
Well, I think there should be large payments made available to encourage Iranian officials to defect, large payments to Iranian military officials who don't follow orders to kill or execute demonstrators and prisoners. I think that has to be made clear. I think it also should be made clear that any Iranian officials involved in these atrocities will be put on trial for war crimes one day. There's nowhere that they can hide. I also think we have to do more to improve communication within the country, to counter efforts by the Iranian regime to shut down the internet and stop the Iranian people from speaking to each other. Shutting down communication makes it very hard for a resistance movement to grow and to overcome the regime. So that should be a priority.
Right. And do you buy into any of the theories that are doing the rounds that, some analysts talking about the Venezuela model? We all know what that means nowadays. I mean, do you see any such model being applied here?
The Venezuela model was a unique model. It's not going to be used in Iran. I think it would be just unacceptably dangerous for American troops to try to do that. Also, the Venezuelan supposed president was not actually the president. He did not win the election last year, and he was arrested under indictments by Trump and Biden for being a narco-terrorist. It was a different situation.
Okay, just to wrap up this conversation, do you think a deal would make the region more stable, less stable, or do you think a deal simply delays the inevitable, which is eventually some sort of a confrontation?
A good deal that I outlined, I think, would make the region more stable. I just think the prospects of such a deal are almost zero, because the regime will only talk about nuclear and it won't make any serious concessions on nuclear. So I think we're going through the motions right now. These negotiations won't last long.
All right. Fred Fleitz, thank you very much indeed for your time, sir. Always a pleasure talking to you.
Good to be here.